you're stumbling towards the kingdom of God. That's what you're stumbling towards when you try to make an aesthetic decision and to put something in your life that's beautiful. And it's unbelievably worthwhile to do that. And you have to steer clear of the frauds and the con artists and all of that. And art is full of that, of course, because it's difficult to distinguish between the real thing and the fraud, but it's unbelievably worthwhile. And so back to literature. I'm telling you this partly because I've been thinking a lot about the humanities and the arts. And practically speaking, because I know that artistic types are also entrepreneurial types, they're the same personality types, and so it's very much worthwhile to make an economic and practical case for this sort of thing. You study literature and the humanities so that you can familiarize yourself with the wisdom of our civilization. Man, you should do that because people have been working on this thing for a long time and it's rich beyond comparison, so why wouldn't you do that? And you teach yourself to read, and you teach yourself to speak, and you teach yourself to think, and you teach yourself to communicate. And I can tell you, if you can read and think and communicate, you are absolutely 100% unstoppable. And that's another thing that's so interesting about the humanities education that's at the core of the university. It's like there's nothing more economically valuable than teaching people how to articulate themselves and communicate, because they can identify problems, they can formulate solutions, they can negotiate to consensus, they can negotiate on their own behalf or on the behalf of others. It's like there's absolutely no downside to it, except that there's responsibility that goes along with it. But it doesn't matter because there's no escape from responsibility. You can either take it voluntarily or you can take it involuntarily. Those are your options, but there aren't any other options. And so we need to understand the role of art and literature and stop thinking about it as an option. It's not an option. It's not an option. What is it said? Man does not live by bread alone. That's exactly right. We live by beauty. We live by literature. We live by art. And literally, not metaphorically. We cannot live without it because life is too dismal and tragic in the absence of the sublime. So, and ourselves, we have to be sharp so that we can survive properly and orient the world properly and not destroy things, including ourselves. And so back to the Bible, which I do think is it's reasonably construed as a piece of literature because it's deep and because the people who wrote it had at least 1 foot in the unknowable. And they're trying to communicate what they experienced in the unknowable to make it known. And that's partly what we're trying to do in this series and what you're trying to do while you're listening and all of that. And so good for that. And also that nation whom they shall serve I will judge, and afterward they'll come out with great substance. There'll be a period of tyranny. You know, and there's a psychological truth to that too. One of the things I learned from reading Nietzsche, because you can learn a lot from reading Nietzsche, that's for sure. He talked about the Catholic Church. You know, Nietzsche is often construed as a great critic of Christianity, and he certainly was. But he was no casual critic. In fact, I think he was the sort of critic that you'd like to have as a friend, because he was the sort of critic that said, well, here's the great things you've done and that you could keep doing, but here's a bunch of really things that you did that you really should stop doing. And he talked about the Catholic Church, and he said what the Catholic Church had done to the European mind in particular was discipline it so that over a period of 1,000 years, 1,300 years, 1,400 years, there was this rule that there was a conceptual structure within which you had to interpret everything. And what that did was turn the educated European mind into a systematizing cognitive entity. And that once that systematizing cognitive entity had been established, then it could free itself from those underlying disciplinary structures and go off and do such things as produce the scientific revolution, for example, which required incredible systematic thinking. And so Nietzsche had this really interesting idea about freedom, and he believed that slavery was an intermediary between the undeveloped individual and the free individual, that you had to submit yourself to some intense disciplinary process for some period of time in your life before you could develop any true freedom. And so you think, maybe you want to learn to play the piano. It's like, that's not going to be any fun for a really long period of time, right? Because you're really bad at it, and there's a million things you have to memorize, and you have to stumble around like an amateur. And the same thing happens when kids learn how to read, and some of them never get past that point, and they never get to the point where they can enjoy reading. But in order to put yourself together, you have to put yourself in a vice and allow yourself to be constricted and mangled even by the thing that enslaves you. But the goal should be that as a consequence of submitting to the discipline, that you become disciplined. And then once you become disciplined, you can emerge from the disciplinary structure as someone who's free. And that's something that's very much worth thinking about as well. So that's illustrated conceptually in this piece of literature, let's say, because what the psychological meaning of what God tells Abraham is that all people are subject, and I mean not equally, obviously, all people are subject to the tyranny that precedes freedom. And that idea is repeated over and over in the Old Testament. It comes out most particularly in the story of Moses, right? Because, of course, that's the story of movement from tyranny. Where do you go from a tyranny? It's an absolute catastrophe. You go from a tyranny into the desert, you know, where you starve. It's harsh. That's what happens in the story of Exodus. And so that's so interesting, too, because what it means is that sometimes if you're going to move uphill, the first thing that happens is you move downhill a lot. And so if you want to escape from the straits that bind you now, you're not going to move forward and go up. You're going to move forward and go down. And that's another reason, this is also something that Jung talked about a lot, is that, you know, on the road to enlightenment, you encounter all the things that you don't want to encounter first, like all the weaknesses of yourself, all the realizations of the tyranny of the world and the catastrophe of nature and all of that. And so you step out of your encapsulation, your ignorant encapsulation, and it's immediate plummet into something that's a desert, let's say, where everything is chaotic and where you're wandering around without direction. A real catastrophe. So it's, you know, because one of the things you might ask yourself is that if enlightenment is possible, then why aren't people enlightened? Because if it was just a matter of going from a good place to a better place, it's like, well, man, let's just get at it. It's no problem, right? Why would we ever stop doing that? But it seems not to be that. It's that you're here and that's not good and it's unstable and you step out of it and it's like down to where you don't want to be. And you have to contend with that, and then maybe you can start your struggle upward. And so God is telling Abraham this, and he's also telling him that it's okay. It's rough, though. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again. That's the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. God is going to leave the tyrants alone until they've manifested their full tyranny for reasons that we don't fully understand. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between the pieces. Albert Barnes said, the oven of smoke and lamp of flame symbolize the smoke of destruction, which we've already talked about, this catastrophe of the initial stages, and the light of salvation. They're passing through the pieces of the victims and probably consuming them as an accepted sacrifice, are the ratification of the covenant on the part of God, as the dividing and presenting of them were on the part of Abram. In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed I have given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river Euphrates. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. So this is a big catastrophe for Abraham, especially in those times, and perhaps now as much, although perhaps people aren't as conscious of it as they once were. I mean, for Abraham, without a biological son, there was no vision forward into the future, you know. And I mean, we don't really know what sort of time span over which these archaic people thought, but the medieval people, we already said, could think 300 years into the future without batting an eye. And these people who were concerned about their descendants were obviously thinking about existence in a way that wasn't just focused on their immediate existence, right? They were thinking about, well, their children and their grandchildren, and maybe their great-grandchildren, maybe the whole society that stemmed out from them. And that's smart. You know, one of the things I learned from Piaget, at least in part, was that his idea of the equilibrated state, which he thought about as part of the biological basis of the idea of moral progress. It's something like that. He was very, very smart, Piaget. And he said that the proper equilibrated state is one where, imagine you have a family, you got 5 people in it, and you're doing what you want in your family, what's good for you, but you're doing it in such a way so that the other 4 members of your family agree with what you do, and that it also facilitates them doing what they want and what they should be doing. And so it's a really tricky arrangement, because it isn't just for you, it's for you in a way that's for them. And you could also see that that would be something that would be a multiplier, right? Because if you have everyone working voluntarily towards the same common goal, then you get a multiplying effect of that. And then you might think, well, it's not just you and your family, it's you and your family today, and next week, and next month, and next year, and 10 years from now, so you have to take the time span into account, and then it should be you and your family in a way that works well in society, and then it should work well now, and next week, and next year, and into the future. It should be iteratable, right? That's like sustainability. It's something like the idea of sustainability. And I would say that's a reasonable way of conceptualizing the holy city. It's something like that. You know, if you're trying to make it concrete, it's like, how should you live your life? Well, let's say you live your life in a manner that justifies its limitation and tragedy. That's a good start. But then let's say that it does that in a way that also reduces the limitations and suffering of the people that you interact with, and now and into the future. Well, maybe there's a way to do that. I mean, a good negotiation does that, right? Because if you're negotiating with someone like your wife, for example, what you want is for her to agree with the negotiation. And one of the things that Piaget said, which I think was brilliant, he said, if you take an equilibrated system, a family, let's say, and a disequilibrated system, so that would be one where, let's say, the father is a tyrant and everyone is operating under his whip, and you put them in a head-to-head competition, the equilibrated system will outcompete the disequilibrated system because the enforcement cost is such that it will slow the system down. You know, because you'll get resistances from the people inside the system. The system will be working at counter purposes to itself, plus there's enforcement costs. And so a tyranny cannot beat an equilibrated system. And I was really excited to encounter that idea, because when I encountered it, I was also trying to figure out if there was some quantitative difference between the systems, say, of the Soviet Union and Maoist China and the systems of the West, apart from just, you know, arbitrary world interpretation as the postmodern nihilists might have it. If there was something fundamental at stake in the terrible Cold War that we fought, or if it was just a matter of opinion. You know, and the Piagetian take was that, well, roughly speaking, is that the West was an equilibrated system, not perfectly equilibrated, but reasonably equilibrated, in that people were essentially, even if they were slaves to some degree, they were at least voluntary slaves instead of involuntary slaves, and that was better. The system was actually technically better, and not just as a matter of interpretation. So that's a lovely thing to know, and I think it's a really solid idea. I haven't been able to, you know, put crowbars under that idea and lift it up. I think it's a good one. So